please subscribe and share for more story. There are moments that arrive without permission and divide a life cleanly into before and after. Margaret Ellis's moment came on a cold November evening in San Francisco. Fog pressed against the windows of a glittering Pacific Heights dining room where crystal glasses and quiet laughter signaled wealth that did not worry about tomorrow. Margaret sat straight backed at the long table, her hands folded in her lap, listening as her only son, Lucas Ellis, stood to toast his promotion. He was handsome, confident, surrounded by his wife's powerful family. When he turned toward Margaret, his smile was sharp and performative. "So, Mom," he said lightly, "how does it feel to finally be a complete burden?" The room went silent. Forks froze midair. Margaret felt every eye land on her, waiting for embarrassment or tears. Instead, she smiled slowly, a tired smile shaped by years of restraint. "It feels," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the stillness, "like never having to pay your rent again." Lucas's face drained of color. His wife, Clara Bennett, choked on her wine. In that moment, Margaret understood something vital had shifted. What sounded like a joke to everyone else was the end of her silence. Margaret Ellis was 61 years old, a retired librarian, and a widow of more than 2 decades. She had raised Lucas alone in a modest Oakland bungalow after his father died in a car accident when Lucas was 10. For 7 years, she had carried a secret that night finally forced into the open. Every month, without fail, she had paid half the rent for the luxury apartment Lucas and Clara lived in, at her son's pleading request. No one at the table knew that the elegant view and polished lifestyle were partly funded by a woman who counted pennies and delayed doctor visits. That truth spilled out of Margaret not as an accusation, but as emancipation. Clara's mother stared at her in disbelief. Clara hissed, "What rent?" Margaret met her gaze, without blinking. "The one my pension has been covering," she replied. The silence was no longer awkward. It was charged. But to understand how Margaret reached this point, how love turned into quiet self-erasure, one had to go back 7 years, to the beginning of a story she had told herself differently for far too long. 7 years earlier, Lucas arrived at Margaret's bungalow glowing with excitement. "Mom," he said, pacing her small living room, "I met someone." Her heart lifted instantly. Lucas was 32, successful, kind. She had dreamed of this moment. Clara Bennett, he explained, came from a family whose names were etched onto buildings and whispered with respect. She moved through the world with ease and certainty. Margaret listened carefully, noting how Lucas's voice changed when he spoke about her, softer but strained, like someone trying to reach higher ground. Margaret lived simply, surrounded by books, old furniture, and memories of a life built carefully and honestly. Lucas earned a good salary as a software engineer, but she knew the numbers. She knew the gap between his income and the world Clara belonged to. A mother recognizes the hollow sound of a lie long before it's spoken. Still, Margaret smiled and asked polite questions. She wanted her son happy. She wanted to believe love would be enough to bridge any distance. The first time Clara came to dinner, Margaret understood what that distance looked like. Clara arrived impeccably dressed, her perfume lingering long after she stepped inside. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloging the worn sofa, the embroidered curtains, the mismatched china collected over decades. "Your home is so charming," Clara said pleasantly. The word landed like a small, sharp stone. Lucas laughed too quickly and rushed to refill her glass. He didn't defend the home he grew up in. He didn't defend his mother. He managed the moment instead. Over dinner, Clara spoke of restaurants Margaret had only read about and trips planned months in advance. Margaret served iced tea and nodded, telling herself not to be sensitive. After Clara left, Lucas asked eagerly, "So, what do you think?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "She's lovely," she said. "If you're happy, I'm happy." He hugged her, relieved. Alone later, Margaret felt the first hairline crack form in the image of the man she believed she had raised. But love, she told herself, meant patience. A month before the wedding, Lucas came over on a Sunday afternoon. They sat on the back patio beneath a sprawling bougainvillea Margaret had nurtured since Lucas was a child. Lucas stared at his hands. "Mom, I need to ask you something," he said. Margaret felt dread tighten her chest. "Clara and I are renting an apartment in Pacific Heights. It's incredible. Views of the bridge." He swallowed. "The rent is high." "How high?" Margaret asked. $4,500 a month. Her teacup nearly slipped from her fingers. "Lucas, that's more than my pension." He rushed on. "I can cover most of it. I just need help with $1,500 for a little while. Just 1 year. I swear. I'll get stock options." Margaret suggested something cheaper. Lucas snapped, panic breaking through. "I already told her family I could afford it. If I back out now, they'll know I lied." His voice dropped. "Please, Mom. 1 year." Under the flowering branches, Margaret made a decision that would quietly dismantle her future. She said yes. The yes came with a condition Lucas delivered softly, as if ashamed. "Clara can't know," he said. "She'd be humiliated. She has to believe I'm doing this on my own." Margaret understood what he was asking. Not just money but silence. She agreed. And so began her private ritual. Every first of the month, $1,500 left her account and entered his. Money meant for savings, for repairs, for her old age. She told herself it was temporary. 1 year became 2. 2 became 3. She stopped buying new books and canceled her yoga class. She lied to friends about why she couldn't travel. Lucas called less. Visits became rare. They never spoke of the money. It hung between them, invisible but heavy. Margaret told herself this was what motherhood looked like. Sacrifice without applause. Support without recognition. She believed love meant endurance. She did not yet see the line between devotion and erasure, or how thoroughly she was teaching her son that her needs did not matter. Margaret often comforted herself with memories of the boy Lucas had been. She remembered him at 7, waking her with a glass of orange juice he had squeezed himself, half of it spilled on his pajamas. "For you, Mommy," he'd said proudly. She remembered evenings at the kitchen table, homework spread out, the smell of stew on the stove, Lucas asking about black holes and ancient history. When his father died, Lucas sat beside her and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of you now." For years he had. Those memories were why she kept paying even as her health declined and her savings vanished. By the time 7 years had passed, Margaret had nothing left to liquidate. She lived pension check to pension check, telling herself it was worth it. But sometimes, late at night, she wondered when love had turned into something that hurt this much, and why the child she would have died for no longer seemed to see her at all. The illusion finally cracked in small, painful ways. Missed holidays. Excuses. A Mother's Day dinner Lucas canceled at the last minute for his wife's family. Margaret sat alone at a beautifully set table, eating leftovers for days. When she gently asked about ending the payments after the promised year, Lucas reacted with irritation. "Don't make me feel guilty," he snapped. "I'll handle it." He hung up. Still, she paid. She paid after being turned away from his apartment door by Clara. She paid after being scolded for making Clara uncomfortable. Each transfer felt heavier than the last. Margaret told herself she was being generous. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was afraid. Afraid that without the money, she would lose her son completely. And so she continued, unaware that the worst betrayal was still waiting and that the woman she would become was being forged slowly in that fear. The 4th and 5th years were when the cost of Margaret's choice became physical. Her arthritis worsened until each step felt like grinding glass in her hips. The doctor recommended physical therapy 3 times a week, but insurance covered little. $400 a month was impossible. Margaret canceled the sessions without telling anyone. "I can manage," she told herself as she gripped the stair rail every morning. Her friend Helen noticed the limp. "This isn't just age," Helen said gently. "Something's wrong." Margaret smiled and changed the subject. She skipped a planned cruise with former colleagues, claiming she was saving for home repairs. The truth was simpler and crueler. She was living like a pauper, so her son could live like a prince, and he barely noticed. His visits dwindled to holidays, and even then he spent most of the time on his phone. Margaret realized she was no longer part of his life, only part of his finances. In the 6th year, Lucas arrived alone one afternoon, restless and distracted. "Everything okay?" Margaret asked. He hesitated, then said, "Clara wants a new car. An Audi Q7. Safer." Margaret felt her stomach sink. "That sounds expensive." Lucas waved it off. "I'm doing really well, Mom. I even got a bonus. Starting next month, I won't need your help with the rent anymore." Relief washed over her, so suddenly she nearly cried. But then he added, "I just need one last favor. $5,000 for the down payment. I'll pay you back in 6 months. I swear." Margaret stared at him. She didn't have 5,000. She didn't even have 500. When she refused, Lucas grew irritated. "What about Dad's account?" he asked. The words froze her. That money was sacred. She told him no. He left angry, without a hug. Days later, Clara posted photos with a new Audi. Margaret understood then that Lucas had never needed her money. He only wanted to know if he could still take it. That realization broke something in Margaret, but not enough to stop her. She kept paying, terrified of losing Lucas completely. Yet the trust was gone. In the 7th year, desperation replaced denial. She was now dipping into her late husband's savings just to pay utility bills. Her cane became a constant companion. When Helen insisted she see a specialist, the verdict was blunt. "You need a hip replacement." Margaret laughed bitterly. "I can't afford it." That same afternoon, Lucas called. "I need the transfer today instead of tomorrow," he said sharply. "It's urgent." Margaret tried to explain she didn't know how to do online banking. Lucas sighed in frustration. "Just do it tomorrow. Without fail." The word stung. Without fail. Like an employee being warned. Margaret stood shaking after the call, anger rising for the first time. The next day at the bank, she overheard other women talking about children who drained them financially. For the first time, Margaret wondered if she was one of them. She made the transfer anyway, but it burned. That weekend, Margaret did something she had avoided for 7 years. She investigated. Online, she searched Lucas's luxury apartment building. The listings showed 2-bedroom units renting for around $3,200, not $4,500. Her hands shook as she did the math. Lucas hadn't been asking her for help. He had been splitting the rent with her and lying about the total. She texted him carefully. "A friend is apartment hunting in your area. What's the rent range?" Hours later, he replied casually, 4 to 5,000 depending. Another lie. When she asked directly what his unit cost, he went silent. Days later, Margaret saw him by chance at a waterfront restaurant, laughing over brunch, paying with a gold card. He looked relaxed, wealthy, unbothered. She stood across the street with her cane, unseen. That night, she calculated everything. 7 years. $126,000. She cried not from sadness, but from rage. Rage clarified everything. The next morning, Margaret put on her best coat and took a taxi to Lucas's building. She asked the doorman about rent prices. $3,100 to $3,400, he said kindly. Water and gas included. Margaret thanked him and walked out steady, upright, unbroken. At home, she vomited from the shock of it. Later, she scrolled through Clara's social media. Aspen. Maui. Designer shoes. Bless life. Every caption crowed. Then she saw an old post. "I was raised to believe a man should provide. So grateful my husband gives me the life I deserve." Margaret closed the laptop, hands calm. That night, Lucas called to remind her about the next transfer. Margaret interrupted him. "You're coming to Oakland tonight," she said evenly. "If you don't, the money stops." The silence on the line told her she had finally taken control. Lucas arrived late and annoyed. Margaret had laid out 7 years of bank statements on the kitchen table. "How much is your rent?" she asked. $4,500, he said automatically. "That's a lie," she replied. She told him about the doorman, the listings, the math. Color drained from his face.
He tried to justify it. Better view.
Privacy. Margaret cut him off. In 7 years, I have never seen the apartment I paid for. She showed him the total. $126,000. She told him about her hip, her pain, the therapy she couldn't afford. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. You never asked, she said. Tears came then, but her voice stayed steady. You turned me into an aim. Lucas claimed he meant to pay her back someday. Margaret asked quietly, when? He had no answer. When Margaret demanded Lucas tell his wife the truth, he panicked. She'll leave me, he said. Margaret looked at him and understood. He would always choose the lie. She told him to leave. At the door, he turned back, bitter. This is your fault too, he said. You never said no. The words stung, but they rang true. After he left, Margaret felt hollow, but resolved. On the first of the month, she did not make the transfer. Instead, she scheduled physical therapy. She fixed the leak in her roof. She began reclaiming her life dollar by dollar. A week later, Lucas texted, We need to talk. She replied, Yes. When Lucas returned, he looked wrecked. I told her, he said. Clara had exploded, blamed Margaret, claimed humiliation. She had gone to her parents. Lucas looked desperate. I can't afford the apartment alone, he said. Just for a few more months. Margaret shook her head. No, she told him he would sell the car, downsize, work harder. That's what adults do, she said. Lucas accused her of destroying his marriage. Margaret answered calmly, Your lies did that. I just stopped paying for them. He left furious. Margaret trembled afterward, but she did not regret it. She was no longer the villain. She was simply done. Weeks later, a call came from Clara's sister, Elena Bennett, asking to meet. Over coffee, Elena told Margaret the truth. Clara had known about the rent for years. She said it was the least you could do, Elena admitted softly. Margaret felt the final illusion shatter. That night, she wrote Lucas a letter ending the financial and emotional dependency. She did not ask for repayment. She asked for change. She left the letter in his mailbox and walked away without limping. The woman who had entered 7 years earlier no longer existed. In her place stood someone quieter, stronger, and finally free. The days after Margaret ended the payments were the quietest of her life. No urgent calls. No reminders. No guilt-laden messages. Instead, there was space. She used the money she had kept to attend physical therapy regularly. The pain in her hips slowly eased. She fixed the leaking roof she had ignored for years and repainted the living room a warm, hopeful yellow. Friends noticed the change immediately. You look lighter, Helen said one afternoon. Margaret smiled. I am. For the first time in years, she woke without dread on the first of the month. Silence, she learned, could be peaceful when it wasn't enforced by fear. 2 months later, Margaret heard through mutual acquaintances that Lucas and Clara had separated. She felt no triumph, only a distant sadness. The life built on illusion had collapsed under its own weight. Margaret did not reach out and Lucas did not call. She focused instead on healing, on walking farther each week without her cane, on tending her garden. The bougainvillea bloomed brighter than ever, a reminder that neglect and care both leave visible marks. One afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on her phone. Margaret Ellis? A woman asked. It was Elena Bennett, Clara's sister, asking to meet. Over coffee, Elena confessed everything. Clara had known about the rent for years and had spoken of it casually, even dismissively. She said it was your duty, Elena admitted. Margaret listened in silence. The betrayal hurt, but it also clarified the past completely. She thanked Elena for telling her the truth. Closure, she realized, didn't always come with kindness, but it did come with honesty. That night, Margaret wrote a letter to her son. She did not accuse or beg. She explained how love had turned into self-betrayal, how silence had weakened them both. She told him the bank of mother was closed, but her door remained open to the man he could become. She signed it with steady hands and delivered it herself the next day, slipping it into his mailbox. As she walked away, she noticed she wasn't limping. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. 2 years passed. Margaret received a new hip and reclaimed her mornings with long walks through her neighborhood. Her home became a place of warmth again. Gradually, Lucas returned, not asking for money, but for time. He fixed loose railings, repaired faucets, and listened more than he spoke. Therapy had humbled him. Apologies came without excuses. Margaret accepted them slowly, cautiously, but sincerely. Lucas eventually introduced Margaret to Hannah Reed, a quiet schoolteacher with kind eyes. Hannah helped with dishes and asked Margaret questions that showed real interest. There was no performance, no comparison. Just respect. Margaret felt something soften in her chest. This, she thought, was what family should feel like. One Sunday afternoon on the patio, Lucas took Margaret's hand. "Mom," he said, his voice thick, "Hannah's pregnant." Tears came freely then. Later, Lucas added, "We want to send you on a trip. Anywhere you want." Margaret laughed softly.
You don't owe me that.
"I need to do this," he replied. She agreed, not for the travel, but because giving had finally become mutual. Margaret Ellis was 63 years old. She was a retired librarian, a survivor, and a soon-to-be grandmother. She had learned that love without boundaries becomes a wound, and sacrifice without respect becomes erasure. The night her son called her a burden had not ended her life as she knew it. It had begun it. She stood beneath her blooming bougainvillea, breathing deeply, knowing at last that self-worth was not something to be earned through suffering. It was something to be claimed, and she had finally claimed hers. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.